So, Sarah, to begin with you. So we know it makes business sense, gender equality, gender balance, it makes sense, and yet organizations are not doing that great. We've got the data for that. But just to make us a little bit more aware and almost sensitive to the issue, can you share with us a couple of ways that gender bias manifests itself within organizations?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Nihad. Like, again, it's an amazing opportunity to be here at the Women's Forum. And I don't know whether any of you have read Nihad's profile, but before us we have a satellite engineer turned journalist turned Harvard Kennedy School policy graduate. Like, so what an incredible woman herself, right?
Thank you.
So please look her profile up. But, you know, I think it's interesting. I think when we think about how gender bias manifests itself in our organisations, one of the things that strikes me is around visible role models. It's really clear that we talk about the importance of female role models, right? So we often talk about, you know, how do we ensure we have diverse female role models? But one of the things I'd love to see more of is also male role models, and things like males taking paternity leave, males demonstrating that, you know, a family-centred life is not leadership, it's not career limiting, but leadership enhancing. So I think visibility of role models is a really critical thing. And it reminds me, you know, like we talked about this story in Japan. So I had a couple of years in Japan as an HR leader, and I can remember my first week there. We were talking about, you know, how do we, you know, look at the gender strategy for our business. And they said, well, you know, we've got the Nikkei ranking in Japan, which helps us identify how we're progressing as an organisation. I said, okay, so how do they measure success in the Nikkei survey? And they said, well, Sarah-san, it's, you know, the number of female leaders at board level. And I said, oh, how are we going there? And, oh, well, we've got, you know, at board level, 34%. Fantastic. That's great, right? You know. And then I said, and what else do they measure? Well, Sarah-san, they measure the number of working mothers at board level. I went, okay, hold on to your seats, folks. How are we going there? And they said, oh, Sarah-san, we've got 3. And I'm like, oh, great. So 3 out of 17, we had 50 board members, so 6%. And I said, oh, who are these, you know, working mums? And they said, oh, well, there's Hui Yi. And I said, okay, from Singapore. Her 9-year-old and 12-year-old are still in Singapore. And I said, who's the next one? Oh, Joelle. Oh, from Hong Kong. Her 15-year-old daughter is in Canada at boarding school. And I said, who's the third? And they said, Sarah-san, it's you. And I'm like, oh, that's right, I've got a 4.5-month-old baby at home. So, but this realisation that we don't tell our stories and we don't talk about, you know, our family lives, and so many of our employees, male and female, are looking for those role models. So I think that's a really important piece around how it actually, you know, unconsciously manifests within the organisations, is that visibility of diverse role models.
Thank you. Helen, would you like to add, like I know you work with lots of different kinds of companies and senior leadership. How do you see it in your sphere of work? How does it manifest itself? What are things we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so similarly, it manifests itself, I think, in an unconscious way. So a lot of the organisations we've been working with at Lean in Singapore are multinationals who are head office tier. And many of them are doing really well when you look at gender representation generally. You know, you've got 40, 50, sometimes up to 60% of women in the workforce. But then when you look at the very top layer, and you look at C-suite, -1, -2, those numbers plummet. And often well below 20, sometimes well below 15. And when you dig a little bit deeper and say, well, what's going on there? These organizations are run by individuals who have, you know, 100% intent to resolve this. They genuinely want to see more women in leadership. They've invested heavily in programs and initiatives. They've tried to de-bias the organization through their hiring processes. But still, at that very top level, it manifests itself. And the question you have to ask is why. And I think that's when it becomes very interesting and somewhat frustrating, because bias happens on an individual level. So you can do a lot to try and remove it through your processes. But unless we're all hyper-aware all the time, it creeps into decisions. And I think that's still the area where we're beginning to focus more and more on, is to try and get more insight into that very top level. And why is it that so much progress has been made elsewhere, but not that very top level?
See, I'm always intrigued when people talk about unconscious bias, because I'm a woman, and I'm a brown woman at it, so it's like a double whammy. And I'm just wondering, like, hang on, am I prone to it as well? Are you prone to it? I mean, we're a self-selected crowd of people here who are clearly, in millennial language, I learned this word very recently, I try to throw it every now and then, we are woke. We're really woke people. So are we also just as susceptible to unconscious bias?
Well, that's the problem, yes. And the problem is that we tend to think there's two types of people in this world. There's the biased people, who we've got nasty words for them. We call them misogynists, and we call them, they're not nice people. We don't like them. And there's the rest of us, and we're not biased, and we're all lovely, kind people who want equality in the world. But that's simply not the case, because the whole point about unconscious bias is it's unconscious. We don't know that it's impacting our decisions. And you and I know, we work together sometimes, that we had I'm constantly prone to this. So I live and breathe gender every day. It's what I do for a living. It's what I do in my volunteer work. And yet I have deep unconscious bias around gender. So I told you the story that if I'm in a car park and somebody's trying to reverse into the spot in front of me, and if they don't get the car in straight away, I end up thinking, oh, I bet it's a woman, which is terrible. I mean, I'm deeply embarrassed. But then professionally as well, it shows up. So we were doing an event on unconscious bias around gender for a group of MBA students at INSEAD. We had a class of, I think, about 95. And we're trying to, very early on in the course, help them be aware of their unconscious bias. And we're doing this session, and about 15 minutes in, Neha says to me, Helen, you do realize that in the last 15 minutes, you've not called on one of the women. You've only called on the men in the room to ask questions and to answer questions for. And I was horrified, because surely I would have been highly aware that I needed not to be biased. And there I was, exhibiting my bias. So we shared it as a story to demonstrate that we all have it, and that it's just very difficult to overcome. You cannot de-bias a person. It's as simple as that.
Okay, at least we are slightly woke, more woke than the people out there who are not in the conference right now. So there's some comfort there. Vikram, what is your experience? How do you see it being manifested in organizations?
So I think, thanks. I think a lot of work has gone into making sure that in the workplace itself, we try and address some of these things. But there are instances, say for example, going out for a drink in the evening, where you still find that there are biases that creep in. Some of them may be conscious, some of them may be unconscious. And there are sometimes still conscious biases where the people say, oh, we're just a bunch of guys going out for a drink. And so the organization has to be able to also influence those, because what ends up happening otherwise is that you think that you've addressed it in the workplace, but the same group of people is extending the workplace beyond to when they go out for a drink, and therefore you're creating that bias even though it's not in the physical office. So that's just one way that you see it.
God, so we need to have more drinks. I think that's great advice. Balaka, would you like to share your experience? Because you're in Korea, and South Korea does not really have the best reputation when it comes in the region with gender. And I'm being very polite as I say that. Would you please share some of what you've observed there?
Sure. I think I've been hearing all the stories, that my co-panelists are sharing, and I think it goes back to some of the stories that we tell ourselves. The narrative that has shaped us for years and years, which are myths. For example, confidence myth. Like, how many of you have heard that women lack confidence? Let's train them on confidence and leadership. Or a pipeline myth, which says that there aren't enough women in the pipeline, even though we want to put them on the leadership position. And women are supposed to be the prime caregivers when it comes to sharing the work and life. Women are not good enough for STEM, and so on and so forth. And I think these are the myths that have shaped us, men, women alike, which is holding us back. It's a story we tell ourselves, it's an excuse we are making for not taking action. And I think this is what we need to change. And I'm so glad that it came up in different ways just among the 5 of us. So we can and we are making a difference.
But is it really a story that we're telling ourselves always? Like, you know, if I just push back a little bit here, I remember the story you shared, Sarah, about coming back from maternity leave. I mean, you'll tell the story better than I would. I mean, to me, that was definitely not an incident where it was a story you told yourself. You were just like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah, and it's funny because I think there's so many different stories that happen in our lives, and I think there's so many assumptions that others understand our situation. And I think there's a balance, right? There's a balance of making sure that we've got more inclusive environments, but there's also a balance of actually telling your truth or speaking your, sharing your story. So the point you were making was around, I came back from maternity leave. My son was born in Japan. Went straight back into, you know, we were having a sales reorg conversation. And I can remember the team were put together, like this team, they were going to work on the sales reorg. We had 1 or 2 meetings, they were great, and then a few weeks later, all of a sudden the team that I was working with presented to the board and said, so we've decided this. And I can remember thinking, where was I, the HR head in those conversations? So I wasn't sure what exactly quite had happened. And I can remember speaking to the project sponsor, and I said, John, you know, I don't know what happened, but somehow the team went ahead and made all these decisions and they didn't consult. What's going on? And he said, let me go and find out, I'll come back to you. And he came back and he said, so apparently the team were meeting, you know, around 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, and you were never here, so they kind of just went ahead without you. And I can remember in that moment I thought, do I say it? Do I say something, or do I just go, oh, sumimasen, gomenasai? And I thought, no, you're a working mum, you're here in Japan, speak your truth. So I did, I jumped in and said, well, John, how do I say this? But in my mind, that's completely inappropriate. I said, I have to go home and breastfeed. My son's like 4.5 months old. I'm still needing to get home at 6 o'clock. I'm happy to go online and take a call, you know, after I've put him to bed. But that's just not acceptable. And you know what surprised me was his response. It was like, oh my goodness, I completely, like, I'm sure the team have completely forgotten, right? Because they see this, the suit, the, you know, the high heels, the pumps walking in. They don't see the mess behind the door, the nappies and the screaming child and what have you. So I think it's really important, A, to remember the intent, that they didn't intend to sort of exclude, but we need to make sure we're explaining what our needs are, and whether that's a working mum or somebody who has carer responsibilities or somebody who's actually saying, no, I've got to work on my health or my mental health, whatever that is, be able to find safe spaces, be able to speak our truth, which then leads to the other piece. We need to create those safe environments.
Which has nicely brought me to the second phase of this conversation, which goes back to the start of this conversation where I was like, okay, what is it that we can do as individuals? So speaking the truth was one of the ideas you just shared. But yes, what is it that each one of us can do in our own spaces, and how exactly? Some top tips from people who are leading organizations in this space. Helen, would you like to begin, please?
So, I mean, this is advice as an individual or as an organisation?
Yeah, no, as an individual.
As an individual.
Yeah.
So, a couple of things. I mean, the first is, we've already talked about it, it's recognising that you definitely have bias and looking yourself in the mirror every morning and going, yep, I have unconscious bias and I need to be aware of it. And then making and creating stories that demonstrate that to other people, to normalise and to stop this sort of stigmatisation of the good and the bad, just this is the way we are. And I think if we can achieve that, if we can be hyper-aware and share stories about our individual biases, that's a big step forward. The next step forward is then giving people permission to then point out when you are behaving in an unbiased way. And I think that's the trickier part. And you and I had an understanding where you could do that. You felt safe enough to be able to say that to me without being worried about my reaction. And I think if we can give within our, whether it's our teams or whether our organizations, permission to each other to watch out for our blind spots, I think that makes a big difference. Because then we'll just get better at stepping into these micro moments and being able to recognize it and to prevent it from impacting important decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think, you know, as an individual, what I have also learned from my own experience, you know, we can do many things, but the top ones which come to my mind are, number one, we need to stop making assumptions on behalf of other women. You know, sometimes we make an assumption that a woman is not confident, or she's not going to go for this assignment because she may have a personal situation. And sometimes even women make assumptions about their own constraints. And I have learned, there was a lady in my team who also had her husband working in P&G, and they both were in different cities. I just made an assumption that she wants to be co-located with her husband. And I went back to her saying, I have a great news for you. You can now do the same job from this another location. And she said, but what's the best location for the job that I'm doing now? I said, this is the current one. And she said, then why you are making the choice for me? And that is the time I learned that we cannot make assumptions on behalf of others. And the second one is we have to be ourselves. The point that you made, Sarah, which is when I went back to Korea, when I went there as a sales leader, there is always this articles that you read which talks about how the culture is, how the working environment is. It's all about the drinking and, getting together with your customers. And, many of my mentors actually told me, no, you have to be yourself. You're going there because you are you. And you don't have to necessarily do what you're supposed to be doing. And I felt that over time, as I made my expectations clear and as I made the rules for my own game, people respect. They respect when you are able to influence positively, when you bring about true difference and you bring results, they accept. So we have to have the courage to be ourselves and set expectations, around us. And I think that is the way we can break the so-called confidence myth and not make assumptions about us and other women.
I think for the men in the room, it's really about saying what can we do differently to help our women colleagues. But also I think one of the challenges is that sometimes women may say that men are not really interested in this, to the point you were making about Balka, about assumptions. So therefore, to the women in the room, I would say, go out and have those conversations. Have the conversations with the people that you feel might be influencers and see what you can do to get them to put this on their agenda. Because very often you will find with all of the conversations that have been happening so far, people are very aware of it. They're just not very clear about how they do anything about it. And so therefore, having the conversations with them to give them ideas and opportunities definitely works.
To the point of including men, I have to say I want to acknowledge the men in the audience here and of course also on the stage here. Can we just have a round of applause for them, because they are here to support us, support the cause, and we're extremely grateful. Maybe one of the things you can decide to do differently is go back and bring some more men into the room, possibly next year. So, yes.
So I struggle with this concept, and sorry guys, thank you for coming, but I struggle with the guys, and we talked about this, that there is not a sprinkling, but a dusting of testosterone in the room. And I would love to see more. And what I'm challenged by is that often these conversations start with how do men support the women, But it's been really interesting. Like, there's a group of guys, and I'm so proud of the work that they're doing in J&J, and we've increased our male participation in the Women's Leadership and Inclusion Group, and they're leading some work around design thinking around why men don't take paternity leave, right? Because it's my favourite role model, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an amazing, woman of our times. She said, women will not have true equality until men share the responsibility of raising the next generation. So my question is, how do we help guys understand the biases that they're facing? Because that is something that sometimes is far more prevalent in our organisations, in our societies. The messages they're hearing, oh, you're going on paternity leave. Oh, you mean you're going on having a holiday? Or I don't know how to be useful. I feel like I have to be productive when I'm on paternity. These are some of the insights that were coming out of this design thinking session with the gentlemen who have taken paternity leave. And I think when we start unlocking those conversations, that we will really shift things. And we're seeing that in some of the Scandinavian regions around the world. The other interesting sort of data point, the Australian press released a stat saying that the number of CEOs in Australia has gone down from 7% to 6% in the last 12 months. Another interesting point that came out in the press probably a week beforehand was the number of men that were stay-at-home dads in Australia between 1991 and 2016, 25 years, increased by guess how many percent? 1%. 1% from 4% to 5% over 25 years. So if we wonder why the gender gap of the WEF, the World Economic Forum number, is going from 100 years to 108 years, it's getting worse. Maybe we need to actually start talking about how do we have more gender-inclusive conversations, exactly. Right?
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think, in Procter & Gamble, we identified this whole area of working with men as allies, not men as saviors, not men to support, but for men to partner and work the solution together. And there's a very interesting program which we are doing, which is called MARC, Men Advocating Real Change, which you may have heard. And in that, we are doing exactly what you're saying, which is helping men and women understand the biases, the privileges that are deep set, and overcome those so that we can create solutions together. And we are already seeing benefit of having men in the conversation because many times they are the hiring managers, many times they are the people who are evaluating other men and women. Even interesting things like women mentoring men. We always think about how women can be mentored by men, but also looking at the other way around. How can women have more men who they are mentoring so they also understand more? So creating that equal conversation is very important for us to create an inclusive solution which is practical and it works.
So everything that you guys have shared as of now is completely in line with the academic research that is happening at INSEAD. And I would actually strongly suggest anyone who's it piqued your interest to understand, like, hang on, what's this all about? Or I want to learn a little bit more about it. I would strongly recommend checking out the INSEAD Gender Initiative website. I've got some really smart colleagues. I can't quite count myself as one of them. I just tap my own mic.
Don't do that. You're apologising for being a female. Right?
There we go. Well, thank you. Thank you for catching me on that one. So yes, I've got these awesome colleagues who spend a lot of their time, and they're like total nerdy brainiacs, and all of the points that you'll have shared has actually been researched and backed by the academics of it all. So what I don't understand is what can organizations do now? Like, you guys are practitioners, you're leaders, you say it makes sense, the academics say, yes, you guys make sense. In fact, you guys are just probably, following what we're telling you to do as well. What is it that organizations can do to change and tip the balance a little bit more? Sarah, do you want to begin?
Look, I think there are several things. I think it's actually addressing the ecosystem holistically. So I think we heard yesterday, there were some great comments around the importance of sponsorship. But I think it's not just sponsoring, and having maybe structures that put sponsorship in place. It's actually making sure that our diverse talent understand the rules of the game and how the game's played, right? So that they understand what's the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And who are the people at the table making decisions from a career perspective of where I want to go that I need to connect with, and understanding how do I build relationship capital in my organisation, right? And understanding also in this age of VUCA where organisations are changing at such a pace that it's not a static thing, it has to be dynamic. Relationship capital has to be a continuous journey. So again, I think whether we use our EIGs or whether it's our business leaders encouraging those conversations, those sorts of conversations are going to be really important to make sure that our diverse talent have the tools to navigate the organisation.
That brings me to you, Vikram, because I know you're doing some really interesting work with mentoring and sponsoring gender balance in your organization. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one of the things that we've done at Citi is to set ourselves certain goals that we would like for representation. But when I looked at the work that was being done to try and help us achieve those goals, the biggest concern I had was that there was a lot of regular stuff happening, but nothing really material to move the needle. So recently, earlier this year, we created a sponsorship program where we identified 10 high potential people at a fairly senior level, women. And working with one of the consulting firms, we put together a 12-month program, which is really focused. The success of that program for me will be that by the end of next year, what is the percentage of those women that make the director title? So we've got a very clear goal in mind. We've got to take them through a journey. It's a 12-month journey, so it'll get over in April next year, but hopefully we'll be able to see at the end of that success in terms of how many people we actually have made a difference to and have gotten to the point where they are ready for promotion to the next level. So that's one aspect. I think the other work that we've been doing is that in consultation with our recruiting agencies, we found that many of our recruiters were not really focused on the gender diversity aspect. And so many of the programs that we had internally were not being sold to candidates when they were actually going through the recruiting process. So we've created, for many of the markets in Asia, we've created kind of a gender diversity handbook that we give to recruiters. And so in all of these markets, the recruiters know what the policies are, what the processes are associated with a more inclusive workforce. And so we're expanding that beyond just gender diversity to a broader inclusion agenda. The aim there being also then to take those playbooks and get hiring managers to go through that. Because very often we've found that when you have hiring managers who are meeting a female candidate and they are asked about what are the policies of the organization, they're stumped. And so we don't present ourselves as a very friendly organization if we do those kinds of things. So those are some of the initiatives that we've got as an organization at this point in time.
Helen, would you like to share some ideas for how companies can do better?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's to stop focusing on fixing the women and start focusing on redefining the workplace for everybody and for modern life. So it was interesting, INSEAD have an online program called the IGDP, and I recently went through the program because I was interested on some of the things they were doing in terms of looking at gender dashboards. But it went back in time and looked at the history of why we are where we are. And essentially the workforce has been designed for the 1950s worker, which was typically a guy with a stay-at-home wife, and everything, all the policies, and all the ways of working are really designed for an individual that just doesn't exist anymore. And that needs to change. So it's less, these programs and having, I think targets are really important, having programs and initiatives in place are important. But I think we need to take a big step back and look at what should the workplace look like? And how do we make it a place that acknowledges that we, as people, have changed? Not just millennials, all of us have changed. And we need to have a workplace that works for us.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit here because it is beginning to feel like, oh my God, there's so much to fix. There's just so much to fix. What can we be hopeful for? What is going well in the region? What can we celebrate? So Balaka,
yeah.
can you?
I was just thinking about what can we do, and I actually came back to the point of what we are already doing. Yes. So first of all, like many of the companies which are doing, is we have a very intentional goal on gender representation and gender equality. We treat it like a business imperative, a business strategy with action plan. People are measured against it. There is a review. So we are very intentional about what we want to achieve at recruitment, to grow women through the ranks and to grow them to the senior leadership. And the second thing we are able to do is to create an ecosystem where women can thrive and so can men. So for example, in one of our plants in Jakarta, we actually created a baby care daycare. It's so practical. So it helped us to get women to 50% in the plant. And even on the shop floor, more than 38 or 40%. It's crazy, and attrition came down much below 3%. So it's dramatic improvement we can see where we can invest behind an identified barrier. In Saudi Arabia, for example, we were the first company to recruit women. In Hyderabad, which is India, we actually offered women the choice to work in shifts and did everything around it so that they, if they want, they can make that choice. Apart from these, the other things which is unique to our company is the voice of our brands. Like SK2, which many of you may have seen, the Change Destiny campaign, the Japan Job to Joy, Ariel Share the Load, through the voice of our brands, where we can actually connect to the consumers. We want to start and spark a conversation. Even at times it can be bold, but at least we want to stand up for not gender stereotyping and starting a conversation which will start a debate. And last but not the least is partnership with external stakeholders like suppliers. One of the work we are doing with actually Women's Forum is Supplier Diversity Network. We want to invest behind women entrepreneurs in supply chain. We want to work with, we are already working with our agency partners who are making our briefs and creating our advertisement. We are working with our retailer partners so that people around us can also improve, and that helps us. That helps us represent women better, that helps us understand our consumers better, and that's actually very powerful to develop this ecosystem and the role we can play and we are playing. So I'm very proud of that, and there's so much more to do yet.
But that comes back to the point where gender balance is not just the right thing to do, because come on, it is the right thing to do, but it is also the smart thing to do for businesses. Yeah. So what are we committing to, panelists? Each one of you has to make a promise, and you've got to keep up to it. And you're making a public commitment to basically follow through. So Vikram, let's begin with you. What are you committing to?
So like I mentioned to you, we're just about to launch a returnship program as a pilot here in Singapore. So I'm certainly committing to make sure that we get that returnship program off the ground by the end of this year. That's our target.
Great. We, as APAC, India, Middle East and Africa, which is our region, as a region, we are committed to invest $150 million on women supplier entrepreneurs alone. And that's not it. So we've already made a commitment to educate 23 million girls on puberty education, which allows them to get educated and helps them to move through the education from the grassroots. And of course, we are committed to make sure we allow women to go for and offer the opportunity for them to do real tough crucible roles and not hold them back. So give them equal opportunity to thrive and succeed.
Woohoo, P&D. Sarah?
So I did a Google search a while ago for the word executive. And when I Googled that word, I clicked on images, and not surprisingly, all of the first 90 or so images were white, pale, male species. The last 10 were Asian, and only 2 out of the 100 were Asian and female. So it's interesting because on Monday I actually started a new role, and the new role is actually Global Head of Exec Search for J&J for corporate functions, and it's based here out of Singapore. So my commitment is to role model that a family-centred life is career enhancing and not leadership limiting, right? And to really make sure that we're pulling through our amazing female Asian talent into those C-suite roles.
Thank you. Helen, what are we committing to?
So my commitment is to include more men in the conversation. So at Lean in Singapore, the initiative that's had the most traction recently is our He for She initiative. And these are events that we run where the room is 50% men, 50% women, and we get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations and trying to make meaning and understanding out of what gender balance and equality looks like in the workplace. And it's always fascinating because what I've realized is that many men struggle with understanding how can they want to engage in the conversation, but they're not quite sure how. And they're worried that if they do, they might say the wrong thing, and then they're going to have a bunch of sort of feisty feminists all beating them up. So then they say nothing, and we don't then get the conversation going. So I am just about to launch a new initiative called Include, which is a daily dose of emails for men to help educate them about how they can talk about gender in the workplace, to give them hints and tips of how they can be a male advocate. And so that's my commitment, is to help include more men in the conversation.
And how do we make sure the men in this room right now sign up to that?
They can go to includeconsulting.com and sign up to the For Him Daily Dose. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so here's a moment for the audience now to think about, what are you committing to? And I'm going to give you all about a minute to turn to the person next to you and share in just one sentence, what are you committing to? Vocalize your commitment to the person next to you, because you will then follow through. Thank you so, so much for being here. It's been wonderful talking to all of you, and thank you for being such an amazing audience.